I understand that I had to be on the panel that separated you from your lunch, and now I'm the moderator that separates you from happy hour. So we'll get right into it. I am filling in for Sarah Porter, who is the director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy at the Morrison Institute. She had a family emergency, so you get me. And I noticed on my sheet, it says that I'm supposed to make overarching comments to set up the panel. I thought, oh, heavens, what's that? And what occurred to me looking at our panelists and the topics that we're going to discuss is that stuff just has to work, right? And it's great to talk about sustainability. It's great to talk about, human right to water. It's great to talk about all of these diverse and very important uses of water. But at the end of the day, we got to grow some food. We need to deliver water for people to drink. Kayakers need to kayak, fish need to swim. All these uses of water actually have to be implemented, and I think we have the perfect panel to talk about that. So, with no further ado, we're going to get started. Ben, we're going to go to you first. Your research, I'm sorry. Actually, the first thing we're going to do is these people are going to introduce themselves, because honestly, other than Dave, I don't know them. So, Ben, would you please introduce yourself, and then we'll go around.
Hi, I'm Ben Ruddell. I'm a professor at Northern Arizona University. I'm also a licensed professional engineer in water resources that does a bit of practice in Arizona, mostly policy consulting. And over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Palumbo. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Operations with the Bureau of Reclamation. If you don't know the Bureau of Reclamation, we're part of the Department of the Interior, and we manage water in the western United States and have projects also around the world that we have foreign policy objectives that we work with other countries on water issues.
Good afternoon. My name is Gloria Montaño Green. I'm the Deputy Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So U.S. Department of Agriculture does many things, from Forest Service to food nutrition, food safety, and then my area, rural development in my area is farm production and conservation means Farm Service Agency, so safety net conservation, farm loan, disaster recovery for farmers. Natural Resource Conservation Services, which is conservation for private lands, workers, communities, and risk management agency to be able to provide risk management tools for farmers. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Laura Condon, and I'm a professor at the University of Arizona, and I primarily work on large-scale hydrologic modeling, specifically focusing on groundwater and groundwater surface water interactions, and a former Bureau of Reclamation employee, so.
So you guys can see now, this is the panel of folks who make things happen. So Ben, sorry, back to you. My first question, your research, data collection, and analytics on water use and on food and manufactured goods supply chain threats due to water and climate disruptions is unparalleled and has clarified the role these factors play in regional, national security, and economic well-being. So that's a tall order. Could you please speak to what is most critical and least understood looking into the next couple of decades, and what needs to be done to start averting what you are most concerned about?
So that's a pretty intimidating question. Let me explain what the question meant about data collection, because I didn't have a chance to give a talk. We have in my lab been one of the teams that's been putting together software and methods for compiling water use data, and basically to explain what people are using water for around the world, from scales all the way from buildings or cities to countries, and looking at water data privacy problems and the legal issues surrounding them, which I think are solvable, but are actually one of the main reasons why we don't have better water use data. And we also have a supply chain data science project, which is my biggest project right now, that's been mapping out how supply chain dependencies work, what makes these, and so you already heard a lot about this today. And the hard part about the question is what is new or people don't see coming, because actually after sitting here listening to this today, I don't have anything to add. I think I think the topics that have been brought up, to summarize, are the major themes, and I think we do see what's coming very thoroughly. It's been described here. Some of the key points that I want to emphasize: affordability or price. It's coming at us. I just stepped down from a 7-year term on the Flagstaff Water Commission. Right now we're talking about a 300 to 400% short-term rate increase. 300 to 400%. Do I need to say that again? Short-term. And that's before the PFAS rules, and that's before more inflation. And that's already one of the most modern and well-run water systems in the country. This isn't a system that's behind the curve. Price is a huge problem. We're looking at a more expensive future, and that's a big deal. Another one, trade, famine, international trade in food. One of my favorite anecdotes or attention getters from talks is, I'll start my talks on these subjects. You heard Dr. Puma bring up around famine, around food trade, and I'll point out that in the last decade or so, we've had 2 of the worst agricultural droughts in human history. Do you know where they were? California, Great Plains. That's in our country. Those are our breadbaskets. How many of us, so raise your hand if you had someone in your family starve to death in the last 10 years? No? How many of you had to take a second job in order to pay for food? No? I noticed the price of meat went up a little bit, but not much. Global groundwater is running out. It's what has enabled us to overshoot and you've heard about this too, it's what's enabled us to overshoot our carrying capacity on water for the production of food. Once that groundwater mining runs its course, which is now happening, you're going to lose a lot of the global food system's diversity, its ability to handle problems in one place or the world droughts, and that's going to contribute to a less secure global food supply. And water prices are going up at the same time. Irrigated ag feeds the world. That's the 800-pound gorilla in the world right now. And all of these issues are going to hit us. They're going to hit the global poor, the global south, the hardest. It's about price, and that in turn is a leadership problem. It all comes back to leadership. And this is what we don't know. What are our leaders going to do? Because we've got a crisis that's going to affect the poor. It's going to affect the global south. Massive investment, massive problem solving, or things are going to take their own course. This is what we don't understand.
That's why your work is so important, is helping people to understand how water is being used and what those trade-offs are, so that they can become engaged in the conversation.
And may I follow up on that?
Absolutely.
Just briefly. I know I'm out of time and I'm eating into the next, but I think that at least in a democracy, a republic, a free society, free speech, free media, education, a key to the entire decision-making process is transparent information. And this is why the lack of good water use data that is transparent and open, just to tell us who's using the water and what they're using it for and how much there is, this is so critical. And it's mostly not a scientific problem. It's mostly a political problem to inform the democratic process. And have you ever asked yourself why we know so little about who's using water and what they're using it for in an era when we know everything about everything?
It's intentional. Yeah, for sure. And I hope we have time to get back to that. But we'll move on to Gloria. You have led an inspiring life coming from a first-generation American family, first generation through college, and into national agricultural policy. And as a result, you eloquently present a very clear view on the role of agriculture in rural life in particular. Its context for the country and the world, and you've done amazing work on disaster relief and resilience. Water is critical for farming, of course, and farming responds to trends in demands for food and other agricultural products. as we look into the future, where water supply may be more competitive and variable, and there's always fights between our agricultural communities and our cities, of course, what kinds of help or information would be most useful for the agricultural community? And how is USDA approaching that through engagement or through universities?
So I'm going to take an approach of that, reminding you that there are multiple parts of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. My area is within the Farm Service Agency, Natural Resource Conservation Services, and the Risk Management Agency, which we're informed of the others. But so I just want to be very clear in saying there's some parts of the U.S. Department of Agriculture I won't be able to articulate well, but I would recommend be looking at, right? So the Agricultural Research Services, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture Investments, the U.S. Forest Service work, and even the market research programs, because as we look at various drought needs, the investments they're doing to be able to understand and research drought resilient crops, to be able to then inform market development and market support is really important to have. What Forest Service is doing for watershed and forest health, and understanding the public land watershed distribution, which many things within Department of Interior also does, and how that supplies not just the public land of Forest Service, but then the distribution of municipal water. And then it was said earlier, right, the various impacts that happen because of drought. So that could be an increase of infestation of Mormon crickets or various diseases. And so those research that need to be able to happen to have those ecosystems. Within the FPAC area, the farm production and conservation, I would say that there's multiple things that we had to think about with regards to agriculture and where this is on water quality and water quantity. I think about it in a few different ways. Is one, how do we think about being part of the climate smart mitigation work and the reduction of greenhouse gas in order to be able to think about those resources and tools that we can able to invest in. Two, we have to make sure that we're protecting farmers and agriculture. And by saying that is we need local supply food chains. There was a discussion, I mean, like this is about supply, but local food supply. The pandemic showed us that all of agriculture was very delicate of it. And the more and more ag land we lose isn't necessarily providing the exact clear resolution of saving water, right? Because these agriculture industries are fundamentally stewards of the land and stewards of the water and have been historically for a long time. So we had to think about indemnity loss and how they survive and how they invest. And we had to think about investments in the long haul for drought resiliency and drought prevention where possible. So conservation work to be able to invest. Natural Resource Conservation Services, if you're not familiar with that entity of U.S. Department of Agriculture, actually got its start due to the Dust Bowl. So historically, right, when the Dust Bowl came, air quality issues, right, reduction, and then ultimately understanding and investment in the soil, and how does that soil prepare for water retention, water preservation, and other items, and has now grown. They are historically lead with, while it wasn't said, but some of that culture shift that needs to happen. Culture shift of a consumer, culture shift of production, understanding new trades, understanding new technologies or old technologies that needed to be adopted in current times. I know we talked about like all the level of technologies, but sometimes we have to go back from technologies from millennia ago and actually implement those because those are the better practices that we should be considering versus the newest thing that was invented last year. So with NRCS, we have a lot of volunteer and incentive-based work to be able to then have that be data-driven. At the moment, I think there's great opportunities that we're investing to be able to have that. Some of it is with the infusion of funds with the Inflation Reduction Act that we received and the infusion of funds with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law specifically gave an increase of funds for the watershed work, in which quite a few of them were done in the West for the watershed food protection. Some of it, I just visited one in the White Mountain, or San Carlos, White Mountain, in the eastern part of the United States, Arizona, right, which is beginning the study to return water in a watershed. And the story was we're actually returning agriculture to a tribal community that almost lost it in a generation, right? And so that's bringing back tribal foods, bringing back local economies and so forth. And the other part is, right, we just recently renounced the Western Water Strategic Framework, which has a very robust way to be able to say, if we're looking, there's not one solution for water quantity work. praying for more rain isn't going to be or snow, and a low snow melt, which is what we all love. Low snow melt would be really great. But that Western Water Framework to be able to inform and provide those tools to states as they're trying to grapple with, for those of us in the West, we've been having mega droughts for a while. For those that are experiencing flash droughts, to be able to understand how do they prepare for it. And that framework is to help that local decision making and that volunteer to understand what are practices to be able to address some of the bigger management needs that you have. And then the other part is market support. If the expectation is to have a more drought-resilient crop, how does a producer understand that there's a demand? How do you as a consumer understand that you want to request that crop and that you trust that crop to be able to be sold to that crop? Because ultimately, you want to make sure to keep ag land in your communities and not use it. And I think sometimes there's some articles and some stories to be able to say, if you eliminate ag water use, we solve the water problem. I'm from Arizona, and 35th Avenue West from here used to be a lot of ag land. And there used to be a lot of citrus trees in this area explicitly, probably where we are within the last 20 years. And that doesn't necessarily change that solution. So we have to be thinking about what are they doing to be able to provide it. So I think it's a more way of how we look at the various aspects of it and collaboration with other federal family members to be able to understand where their policies, where I work with farmers and ranchers, Bureau of Reclamation does irrigation districts, and then sometimes we figure out where our common needs and practices are.
Yes, because although people love to equate water use with population growth in the West, water use is land use, and land use is water use. And you guys are on the hot seat when it comes to land use and those types of decisions in our rural communities. So good on you. That's awesome. Okay, Laura. Dave, I'm saving you for last because I'm going to ask you the toughest questions. Just prepping you for that. Okay, good. All right, Laura, you are one of the young academic leaders of the field who has shown a remarkable talent for innovative research and commitment to addressing real-world challenges. Long persistent droughts and intense floods challenge surface water systems and groundwater systems. Storage is needed more than ever. In terms of getting water where it needs to go and providing resiliency for our communities. Given the potential for cheap, unlimited energy from solar and wind, what do you see as future opportunities for modifying supply and demand for water, urban and rural? This is a really tough question, I'm sorry. Urban and rural in the context of storage, provision, and operation.
I don't even want to know what David's question is, if this was the softball. But I'll just start off by saying that I really appreciate it. I appreciate going after the last panel because I think some of the comments about really rethinking how we frame problems and recognizing that we are stuck not just by our thinking, but by our infrastructure and our policy, which are very hard to change, even if we open our minds a little bit, is a really good context for thinking about storage. So when I was reflecting on this question and, okay, well, what if energy wasn't a problem? Now can we fix storage? And unfortunately, no, there's a lot of barriers still. So I work a lot in groundwater, so I think about the resource, which is all of the pore space that we have available from all the unsustainable pumping that Ben so nicely teed up for me. And I do think we could really think differently about, the future of storage in several ways. One, in the centralized sense that we think about like how we manage reservoirs and really, centralized groundwater recharge facilities. I think Arizona is a great place to have that conversation because we have a great history of that in the United States and can show that working. I think there's still big challenges around that because we're really tied to our infrastructure, our big water delivery infrastructure, which is designed around our surface water networks. So it's not necessarily a cheap solution, even if the energy problem was totally solved. But the other way that I think we could broaden our thinking about storage a bit is to think about the role of subsurface storage in our watersheds in general as the largest, by far the largest freshwater storage we have. And it plays a really important role in watershed health health, ecosystem health, watershed yields, and in irrigation demand and the regimes of soil moisture. So I think that kind of, we can think about that in two ways. One, places which is not Arizona or the Western US, where we haven't depleted groundwater so much, that there is really value in leaving that storage in place. And we generally only can think about storage that we're using for economic benefit. But to think about what is the value of the storage we have and the value of keeping that there, along the lines of what Ben was talking about in terms of stability of our food systems, but also just how our watersheds function, keeping that in place. But then number two is, in places where we do have all of this available pore space, how can we make it possible to more flexibly do distributed recharge outside of these big facilities? So I'm thinking about things like microdams and small structures that can keep more water on the landscape. There was a lot of talk about that with flooding in California, about how can we divert flood water onto irrigation, onto agricultural landscapes, so that their water tables are higher, maybe they need less irrigation, or maybe at least their pumping is cheaper. And so I think thinking about that at a really broad scale could help both with conveyance challenges and demand questions. But in the way of that, are a bunch of policy, big, really, really hard policy problems. So I think step one is to open our minds, but then step two, we have to address some really big fixed pieces which are difficult.
So, and people kind of argue back and forth about whether we, and to what degree we will increase surface water storage capacity versus groundwater storage capacity. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, I hesitate to answer that while sitting by David because I feel like the Bureau of Reclamation is in charge of dams in the Western U.S., but I'm not an expert in that. The sense that I get is in a lot of systems, we have built a lot of the most economically viable, we've taken a lot of the most economically viable places to build dams already, and it is more expensive today to build a dam than it was in the past, and there are a lot more environmental concerns to think about. So I think that makes groundwater storage even more promising as an opportunity. But I would like to hear David's thoughts on that.
Dave, the Colorado River, what's going on? No, just kidding. That's actually not your question. I mean, you can answer if you want. No, your question is the following. You provide the frontline federal leadership for operating the large water infrastructure in western U.S. river basins, and that has been critical for public health, economic development, all the things that we value out here. The mega droughts in this century have brought the allocation of water and the efficiency of large reservoirs into focus. Can you speak to the key challenges that emerge, who they impact, and how similar challenges may emerge worldwide as the climate continues to change? And if you want to also tell us how you're going to solve the Colorado River as you answer that question, that would be okay.
Thanks, Kathryn. I'll attempt. Again, the Bureau of Reclamation manages water in the West. Essentially, think about the 100th meridian, that longitudinal line in West, through the middle of North Dakota down to the Texas Panhandle. It necessitates irrigated agriculture, hence the large infrastructure that was built in the West in the 20th century based on 19th century laws. So I'm going to tell you something first that you already know, this audience already knows with respect to climate change. The Southwest in particular and the West in general is getting drier and getting hotter. And it is necessitates new thinking around water scarcity. With respect to the sectors that are impacted, all sectors are impacted, whether it's municipal, industrial, agricultural sectors. And of course, as we heard from the last panel, there's a disproportionate impact, what I call a cascading and compounding environmental justice impact on disadvantaged communities, especially tribes and rural communities that don't have access to clean water. So it just makes that problem a little more difficult. With respect to the worldwide element, I'm going to say maybe something controversial. It's maybe a good thing that it's worldwide. Of course, it's a bad thing that it's worldwide, but the good thing that's worldwide is that we can look at opportunities how others are solving problems. We can look at proof of concepts where we bring together the best available science, the best available practices, whether they be historic practices or whether they be innovative practices. And so how do we do that? Again, the last panel I thought was great, and I have a different terminology that I've been using. We often think about non-stationarity in science, that the history past is no longer a prologue for scientific efforts with respect to climate change and relying on the instrumental period of record to predict the future necessarily. But the same thing applies. We should think about non-stationarity with respect to policy. We cannot rely on the old policies that we have to advise new policies. Some of them are good. Some of them we need to continue. I often talk about doing the more with the same amount of water, doing the same with a less amount of water, and doing less with less amount of water. We need to think about all three of those. We've been historically focused on doing more with the same amount of water. And the reality is we don't have the same amount of water. We need that technology. We need to look at water reuse and recycling to perhaps do the same in some respects. But we also need to get real and understand that we're not going to always be able to do that, and figure out how we can do the same with less or less with less. A little bit on infrastructure, and a couple different stories that have recently come to mind in the Colorado River Basin. When we designed our infrastructure in the 20th century, we never thought we'd be down at these low reservoir elevations. When we constructed dams, in-stream dams, we would often put a cofferdam upstream and a cofferdam downstream, and we'd bore through the embankment and we'd bypass that water. When the dam was constructed in the dry, we'd plug those bypass tubes, or we'd repurpose them for spillways, never thinking we need to get down to those low elevations again. Hoover Dam, Glen Canyon Dam, bypass tubes have been plugged or repurposed for for spillways, and it's kind of ironic. We're a far elevation away from needing those spillways. Another story about Glen Canyon Dam is we never thought we would get down to what's called minimum power pool. So the stilling well that was installed at Glen Canyon Dam to measure the elevation of the reservoir behind Glen Canyon Dam, Lake Powell, bottoms out at the top of the penstocks, because we never thought we would get down to those lower levels and need to make those measurements. The final item I'll talk about before getting to perhaps some solutions is snowpack. We talked about snowpack. We called that in the Bureau of Reclamation our nth reservoir. So it provided that accumulation in the winter, usually peaked in April. It would run off in the spring slowly and end in the middle of the summer, and it acted like a reservoir. That was infrastructure. We viewed snowpack as infrastructure. Now, we cannot rely on it. The snow is coming as rain, or it's melting earlier because of temperatures, and so it's coming at the wrong time. And so in some of our basins across the West, this particular year, we're going to go into flood control operations at some of our facilities, but we're in drought, because we're going to need to pass this water outside of the downstream to make space for this runoff that's going to come early or come as rain. But ultimately, given the forecast that we have, we're going to have to provide less than full allocation for our agricultural users. So it's a phenomena that we need to grapple with. So as Gloria mentioned, we have the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act. We have lots of money coming in to try to address these problems. And it really is going to take folks coming together and thinking about policies, how we implement these projects on the ground. We have money for new storage. We have money for increased storage. We have money to line canals, to pipe canals, to desalinate water, to reuse water, to change water use. But we've got this suite of laws on the books, policies on the books, practices on the books that are very difficult to work through, very contentious. They set up priorities for uses of water that folks want to hold on to very tightly. So we need to work through, from a policy perspective, how we deal with those laws, how we have parity and proportionality in reductions that come down the pike, and do that in a smart way, being mindful of the laws that we have to follow. And we also need to rely on what's worked in the past in the Colorado River Basin for the last 15 years or so is collaboration and voluntarily deciding to make reductions to try to save the river. I often say you just need to try, instead of giving up nothing to lose everything, you just need to give up a little bit to really save a lot. So it's that collaboration that we need to rely on. And again, we can learn from other countries that are experiencing similar effects because of climate change around the world.
Interesting. Well, and another theme that's been spoken of often today is money, right? And right now we're using federal money to help at least alleviate some of the problems on the Colorado River. But, looking forward, there's a lot of needs for storage, needs for aging infrastructure, needs for underserved communities. So how do we balance all of that out? I'm going to throw that open to all of the panelists. How do we prioritize that? And is there going to be enough federal investment? Will there ever be enough? Or will it always be too little and too uncertain to help solve some of these problems? Who wants to?
So I think maybe a common theme that we have is where we are working to implement the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of them are in traditional programs, and other ones are in new programs, and there is an infusion of funds. But ultimately, and I can't remember who said it earlier, if you want to do any food system transformation, it has to start with local people and local concept. And so we are very much voluntary and incentive-based, and we have to figure out how to bring folks in. Our work at USDA has really been looking at multiple things in our strategic plan, but our really focus is climate-smart agriculture. How do we develop new and better markets and strengthening when you're thinking about that? That's not just economies for a farmer, for others. That's actually to make sure that we have sustainable local economies for rural communities, and then thinking about equity. And I think the first part is you don't think that you can't solve climate smart agriculture and forestry without thinking about equity at the same time. And we've done it in some of our notices of funding opportunities. But also when you're looking at historically underserved communities, you have not just that they've been underserved, but you have a deficit on their capacity to apply for these federal contracts or to trust government to come in. So working with university partners, working with local municipalities, we've been doing a lot of investment with capacity, with cooperative agreements and technical assistance outside to come in. So I think I don't know if it's not explicitly to your question, but I think you have to approach it in different ways. There's the creative work that needs to have, there's the historical work that maybe has been unfunded, and then there's also thinking about different ways to consider. So like for us, the framework that we just released last year is to also help to say, here are the practices we have to be able to put the suite of tools together to be able to consider it and engage. And for an agriculture, when you think about equity in underserved communities, you have to think about it, yes, maybe race, gender, and ethnicity, but you have to think about of locality of communities, what crops have been grown, what size of crops, what has received the funding for the traditional work, and also like where the demands are versus aren't the demands. And so it's not I think as long as you have to go in openly to say, I have to try to find solving of items. And I'll just finally say that in the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodity, which is about $3 billion that we invested with projects across the country, to say we have to think about diversification of markets while we're also thinking about climate smart practices and how do you, if you want that commodity, you can go buy climate smart friendly crackers in your grocery store. Do you know what that means? Do you know how that's measured? Do you know how it's engaged? And so if we're expecting that to happen and expecting that to happen at a greater scale, how do we actually measure it? How do we actually understand the input of a producer? But when we ended up doing that is where folks gave completely to the practices, there's a lot of co-benefits. They're doing food justice, food access, community engagement, water preservation, and greater regenerative agriculture work. So I think you had to kind of go in open of some expectations that what you measure is one, but your co-benefits are going to be really much there.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
I will, for better or worse. So the western U.S., the Southwest, the modern Southwest, the problem that we're talking about right now, the fact that most of us are sitting here in this room today, is because of a huge federal investment in the Bureau of Reclamation and its accoutrement, right? So this is not really ancient history in our case. We're within just a few generations of when that all happened. My point here is that was a leadership decision by public leaders to subsidize and invest huge amounts of money into creating the system that we're living in. It didn't arise. This configuration didn't arise organically from the grassroots. It was helicoptered in to some extent by DC, and that's not such an uncommon story around the world. In many other places that are like this, that are reliant on agriculture, fed by groundwater or irrigated ag for their food supply, they have central government, big concrete, big steel plans that have been put into place. That's a system was created. My point is this, and it gets back to my leadership comment from my answer. These systems need big leadership decisions and hard trade-offs. The fact that we're looking at huge increases in prices right now, in my view, it's not because things have suddenly gotten a lot worse or more expensive. It's that we're finally starting to look at the real costs of the system, when in fact it was our great-grandparents' federal taxes that subsidized the whole thing, and we've been getting a free ride since then on our water resources in the West. So the cost increases are huge. They're real. They're an order of magnitude. That's politically significant. This requires major political action. So I'm not discounting. I wrote an opinion piece a few years ago arguing for voluntary rotational fallowing programs that are funded by reverse auctions, where cities pay farmers to temporarily fallow. I put that out there, others did too. I'm not discounting that sort of thing. We absolutely need those programs, but this is a situation that's going to require major leadership decisions that are very consequential. And I'll give you some examples of possible futures, right? Countries and regions where the leaders choose to put large amounts of money into new infrastructure are going to have food supplies in the 21st and 22nd century. They're going to be food exporters. They're going to be able to sell higher priced food crops on the international market. But they're going to have to socialize that cost. They're going to have to charge the auto manufacturers, the computer chip manufacturers, the software companies, everybody money to subsidize that. That's a way you can go. And the places that don't choose to make those investments aren't going to have that capacity that they used to when the water runs out, right? So that's a leadership, that's a fork in the road. You can also decide to put huge taxes, like sin taxes, on beef and dairy products, right? So I recently had an article that, like many others, pointed out that a lot of the water is used for beef and dairy production. So if you can just, with policies, squeeze a lot of the beef and dairy consumption out of the system, it'll reduce demand for irrigated ag and maybe save some water. Talk about unpopular politics. Try to do that in the United States. It takes leadership and investment, large amounts of money, large amounts of leadership, large amounts of subsidy, taxation, reallocation. These are policy decisions. They're leadership decisions, right? It's not going to happen by itself. And if the leaders don't act, that's also a decision, right? Then things are just going to take their own course.
Please.
Can I just add to that, right? Because I think when it's talking about leadership, we have to also think about that it's multiple levels of it. The western part of, the eastern part of Arizona is a huge, deep agriculture root community. I mean, beaver trapping was what came into southeastern Arizona, right? That was the history pre-Tombstone. And
Along the Gila.
And if you were to see some of those things there, you'd be shocked about what are the river flows, and like, I don't even know if there's a fish, let alone that there's beavers, right? And that's a generation. So I would say that there is leadership decision, but it is also how are the pieces of government and pieces of will and demand from individuals that need to come together. There's a lot of decision making that happens on residential zoning, on zoning of residential agriculture or commercial, et cetera, that needs to happen at the local level and that we can incentivize. And we are doing a lot of incentives to be able to find what are ways to be able to do resource investments, change your practices, be able to think about efficient water use, and be able to move towards other ways of doing it. But it has like multiple leadership, and so the conversation is what do folks want? What do county officials, what do state officials, what do local governing have to be able to have those implementations, right? There was changes specifically for Central Arizona project that was done not because of federal requests, but how the governing board wanted to make changes to move forward. So I would say that as we think about leadership, it's like a consistent way of how policy is communicated to be advocated for, because there's a lot of things that we're implementing the Inflation Reduction right now and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is an infusion. Some of that money was given with creativity, right? To be able to say, we just know you have to work towards finding that solution. Here's some authorities for you to just seek it. And other ones came with very strict ones. So as we're thinking about policy, there's some pivots that we can't necessarily work on. We implement the Farm Bill quite a bit. The Farm Bill is up for renewal. And whatever's in the Farm Bill is what money comes with it. To be able to go forward. So I would just share that there's roles of leadership and advocacy in all parts of it to be able to move forward. And, you know, just this, I mean, I know this is a global summit and conversation, but you're sitting in Arizona, who has the 5 C's, cattle, citrus, climate, cotton, and copper, the 5 C's. You see it in the flag, and those citrus orchards aren't there anymore. Is it a need for a transition due to climate, to investments, to other items? Is it a transition of economic priority changes, et cetera? So I just think that there's like some layering and some guidance, right? Because the policy of understanding what is some of those, I just think the University of Arizona is doing some really robust, great training within like the Yuma County, within Cochise County, et cetera, to understand how do you support understanding industries and the communities, which also have 90% of their survival and jobs on agriculture. And so if you're not thinking about them as a whole and then thinking about those resources, and I think Yuma County is a huge part of discussions, but it's like 95% water efficiency, and I think the Director of Agriculture here will tell you that in a heartbeat at any moment. If he hasn't told you, then just stop him and ask him, and he'll give you the fact.
So many interwoven layers of governance and leadership and money is all it takes to solve this. I don't see what the problem is. Okay, I think I have 30 seconds left for my panel, which maybe anyone want to stand between this lovely crowd and happy hour and raise your hand? Doesn't look like it. Okay, rapid round. Name your favorite water-related animal.
Oh my gosh. I was not prepared. I'm like going to say sea otter, which doesn't even, that's a, you know, not
That's
a
an
freshwater
excellent
animal.
answer. That's
They're
an
cute.
no, well, okay, yeah,
Super cute.
excellent answer. Okay.
I grew up in Michigan, so loon.
Okay.
Loon, yeah, at
Also-
night specifically.
Also acceptable. Dave?
It's going to have to be otter as well, because the Bureau's mascot is Otto the otter.
Of course.
So-
See, it
Of
was
course.
formative.
There was
My
only-
Why not a
year, it got
beaver? I don't
imprinted on
know,
me.
but
There was really only one answer for you, Dave, and you nailed it. That was awesome. Gloria.
You know, unfortunately, I don't know what the name of the animal is, but when I was growing up, there was these tadpoles that would just disappear in the water and the dirt, and then it would get like this great monsoon rain, and then they would just like all of a sudden pop up in the little puddle of water. So I guess, you know, these frog toads that are just like, I don't know their exact ones, but they would just always disappear because like they were just magic.
Excellent. Would you guys, also a fantastic answer, and thank you for your originality on that one. I think it's a Sonoran toad, maybe? I'm not positive. Will you guys please join me in thanking this wonderful panel?